Live from Capitol Hill, this is Capitol Hill with Adam Preston, joined tonight by Danny Concannon. Danny is a White House correspondent for the Washington Post. Glad to have him on. We just are getting word of new leadership in Congress. Any thoughts so far?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting upcoming session. We have a very tight battle in the Senate. As you know, the Senate's there's a one-seat majority, so that's going to be tightly contested. So what the House does is going to be very interesting. And so you have a Republican majority, and both parties have new leadership. No leadership from the previous Congress remains. So it's going to be interesting to see how these new leaders step up to the plate.
Absolutely. And let's go ahead and break it down a little bit for our listeners. So the new Speaker of the House it's going to be like a game show, Danny. New Speaker of the House, go.
It is going to be Kirk Falmerhammer from New York, the 27th District. It's kind of interesting. So far, we're seeing that he's introducing a lot of red meat bills. He's spearheading the president's immigration policy, and yet we're talking about a New York Republican, which in most instances, those are your blue dogs. Your blue dogs.
Yeah, your moderates.
Your moderate Republicans. And for some reason, he's not playing that. I'm not sure how that'll impact New York, but it'll probably set up for an interesting session.
So do you expect that he will lead, from the right? So with Paul Ryan, we saw a lot that, he would reach out to all sides and try to put something together, some sort of compromise. Do you think that the new speaker is going to continue in that tradition, or is he just going to try to railroad like we see a lot more in the Senate?
So that's where we are at a crossroads, because we really don't know what to expect of the new leadership staff. So you have both sides with new leaders and no fundamentally adversaries. They are potentially two being able, if they choose to, they have to choose to. So either the Republicans can go to the right and have majorities both houses, or they could actually go from the Senate and see what bridges they can build with Democrats. It's going to be very interesting.
It is. You're starting to break up a little bit. I kind of missed that, but I got your point. Who are we seeing as the majority leader coming in?
So the majority leader, it's very interesting. We have Henry Jewell, and we don't know much about Henry Jewell so far. And as we go into the session, this is where you kind of get a feel of where each player in Washington is going to end up. You have your conservatives; they introduce very red meat bills. You have your liberals; they introduce their very progressive bills. But Henry Jewell, for a House Majority Leader, has been very quiet over the last few months since retaining the majority, and we haven't heard much, which is contrary to the Minority Leader in Calvin Ward, and Calvin Ward is very vocal so far. He's very active on Twitter and has.
Good. Tell us a little bit more about. Yeah, no, that was a good segue. Go ahead and tell us a little bit more about the Minority Leader.
Yep. Minority Leader Calvin Ward. So far, he's been very active on social media. He's kind of gone after the vice president. They've had some back and forth, which is becoming very interesting. I'm sure it's going to play very well on late night with Rainey Roberts. But he's introduced a infrastructure bill that is very moderate, and I imagine, if anything, next to immigration, that's maybe one of the bills you see very early in the session.
just looking at the state that the minority leader is from, I mean, Congressman Ward's from Arkansas. We can probably expect that he'll take a more moderate tone moving forward.
And so that that's the groundwork. So we look at where the leadership's coming from, and so as we mentioned earlier, the speaker's from New York. So you would imagine he plays a traditional moderate role, and so now you have a minority leader that's also from a state where he would likely be a moderate. So it's going to be very interesting to see if those two moderates can come together and work out some of these legislations, because if you do, then we may see some of the most progress that we've seen in decades, since the House has been very contested over the past few Congresses. Maybe they can put stuff aside and actually govern.
Another question I'm considering is, are they going to be able to manage their own side?
See, that is the question, because, we're talking about new leadership, and when you have new leadership, you have to set certain standards for your caucuses, and we'll see if the caucuses stay in line with the new leaders or if they decide to go elsewhere. And depending on, who controls their side the best will likely decide who has control of Congress in the midterms.
It's very true. New session of Congress is starting up on Wednesday. Any ideas what to expect?
I imagine we'll see immigration first and foremost. The Speaker announced that it'll be on the first docket when he introduced it. I know it's been highly contested so far. POTUS announced on Twitter that he'd be open to bipartisan talks, and then the next day, the Republicans introduced their immigration policy. So I know that in itself, from what I hear from Democratic leaders, is just a little bit of a sour note heading into the session. They were optimistic when the president said lots of talk about bipartisanship. So let me say now that my door's open to any Democrat who wants to talk about common sense measures regarding legal immigration. And so he opened the door for bipartisanship, but then the next day they introduced their plan. So it's kind of interesting, the timeline.
Why doesn't, I guess this is rhetorical going to the reporter, but why doesn't the Democratic leadership just work around the Republican leadership, just go straight to the president and try to work out a deal that way?
Well, in theory, that would be the next approach. But, in essence, you want to have everyone at the table. And because even if Democratic leadership goes to the White House directly, you'll still need the Republican leadership in the House to pass it, let alone the Senate, which is going to be even more contested. And unless they come up with a bipartisan approach, I don't see it getting past the Senate before the midterms.
Do you see, maybe this is just me trying to read in too much into it like the media often does, do you see any sort of gap in the positions of the Republican leadership in the White House on the issue of immigration? Do you think they're pretty much in lockstep?
Yeah, from every indication so far, the Speaker and the leadership are in lockstep with the President. The President came out very supportive of the bill. From every understanding that we have, it's the President's bill that was introduced. The Democrats themselves have introduced their own version. Both bills have good parts. And so if there was a bipartisan measure, maybe they would get something that would pass. But there's little bits and pieces on each side that the progressives wouldn't like and the diehard conservatives wouldn't like. So they have to be able to come together. But like I said earlier, the Senate's seat majority, and you have to get closer, and it's not likely to happen unless it's a bipartisan measure.
Well, Mr. Danny Kincannon, thank you for your time today. Let's go ahead and give you an opportunity for a parting shot before you sign off.
Well, thank you, sir. And I'm not sure I have a parting shot that's going to pass up Whoopi, but we'll see. The minority leader is trending on social media, and I don't think that I can surpass him. So on that note, conversation, and it's going to be a very interesting session.
I agree with that. I think it certainly will be interesting. I'm looking forward to watching it play out and to discussing it further with you again in a later date. For those of you listening at home, Capitol Hill is a free government simulation. Come play with us at TedderVision.com/Capitol Hill. That does it for us here on Capitol Hill. Have a good night.